Sometimes the loneliest people find each other in the most forgotten places. At 68, Apache hunter Tahan thought he was done with caring about anyone but his old wolf Kaska. He bought a ghost town for $100, looking for a place to spend his final years alone. But when he opened the door of what should have been an empty cabin, he found a desperate mother and her 2 children hiding inside. They had nowhere else to go. The children stared at him with frightened eyes. The mother stood ready to protect what little she had left. Tahan could have walked away. He could have told them to leave. Instead, something stirred in his weathered heart that he thought had died years ago. What happens when a man who has given up on the world discovers that the world hasn't given up on him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind carried stories that most men had forgotten how to hear. Tahan pressed his weathered palm against the cracked leather of his journal, feeling the weight of 30 years' worth of tracking notes, weather patterns, and observations that no one else would ever read. The worn pages held his life's work, a methodical record of a world that grew smaller with each passing season. Beside him, Kaska lifted her graying muzzle to test the air. The wolf had been his companion for 12 years now, longer than most. Partnerships lasted in either the human or animal world. Her amber eyes, clouded slightly with age, still held the intelligence that had made her invaluable during their years of wandering the borderlands between Arizona and New Mexico. "Nothing out here but us old ghosts," Tahan murmured, scratching behind her ears. The wolf's tail gave a single thump against the dusty ground, her way of agreeing with his assessment. They sat on the ridge overlooking Crow's Hollow. A settlement. That time had forgotten sometime in the 1920s when the silver mine played out. 23 buildings in various states of decay dotted the valley floor. A general store with its false front still standing proud despite missing half its roof. A saloon where the batwing doors hung askew. Cabins that had once housed hopeful miners and their families. And at the center of it all, a small church whose bell tower leaned at an angle that defied physics. The real estate agent in Tucson had looked at Tahan with barely concealed pity when he'd inquired about the property. "Mister, ain't nobody been out there in decades. No water rights, no power, no road worth mentioning. Why would you want such a place?" Tahan had counted out 10 crumpled tens onto the man's desk. Sometimes a man needs to disappear. The agent hadn't asked any more questions. Now, 3 days after completing the paperwork, Tahan studied his purchase with the same methodical attention. He'd once used to track wounded deer through thick brush. The town sat in a natural bowl formed by red sandstone cliffs, protected from the worst of the desert winds, but isolated enough that a man could live out his years without seeing another soul, if that's what he chose. And choice was what this was about. At 68, Tahan had grown tired of moving from place to place, sleeping under stars that seemed colder each year, hunting game that grew scarcer as the cities expanded their reach into the wilderness. His tribal homeland held too many memories of the wife and daughter he'd lost to influenza 20 years ago. The cities held nothing but noise, and the stares of people who saw his braided grey hair and weathered features and made assumptions about what kind of man he must be. Kaska whined softly, sensing the melancholy in his silence. She'd been a gift from his daughter before the sickness took her. A 6-month-old pup with oversized paws and eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. His daughter had insisted that every Apache needed a wolf companion, even though the old ways had long since given ground to modern realities. "Papa, she'll keep you from getting too lonesome," his daughter had said, pressing the squirming pup into his reluctant arms, "and maybe she'll remind you that some things are worth protecting." Those had been among the last words his daughter spoke to him. Within a week, both she and his wife were gone, victims of a flu that swept through the reservation like wildfire. Tahan had buried them according to Apache custom, then walked away from everything he'd known and never looked back. Kaska had been his only constant companion through 2 decades of wandering. They'd lived off the land, trading pelts and his tracking skills for supplies in small border towns where his reputation as a hunter preceded him. He'd guided city hunters who wanted to play at being outdoorsmen, tracked lost children for desperate parents, and occasionally helped the border. Patrol find smugglers who thought the desert would hide their movements, but the years were catching up with both of them. Kaska's joints stiffened on cold mornings, and she slept longer than she used to. Tahan's own body carried the accumulated aches of decades spent sleeping on hard ground and walking rough terrain. His left shoulder, injured in a fall 5 years. Ego never quite healed properly. His eyes, still sharp for distance work, struggled with close tasks in dim light. Crow's Hollow represented an end to running, a place where he could build a fire without worrying about who might see the smoke, where he could speak aloud to Kaska without fearing some hiker might think him addled, where the silence would be complete and unbroken. He'd brought enough supplies. For 6 months, canned goods, ammunition, basic tools, a water filtration system, and solar panels that would provide minimal electricity for essential needs. The spring that had originally sustained the mining camp still flowed, though he'd need to test its purity and possibly dig a proper well. The evening sun painted the ghost town in shades of amber and rust, softening the harsh edges of abandonment. From his vantage point, Tahan could see the layout clearly: the main street that ran north to south, the residential cabins clustered around the commercial buildings, the mine entrance sealed with rusted iron bars, and beyond it all, the small cemetery where weathered wooden crosses marked the graves of those who'd never left. "What do you think, old girl?" he asked Kaska. "Think we can make this work?" The wolf stood and stretched, her movements careful but deliberate. She looked down at the town, then back at Tahan, her expression patient. She'd follow him wherever he chose to go, as she always had. As the sun touched the western rim of the canyon, Tahan made his decision. Tomorrow they'd descend into the valley and begin the work of making Crow's Hollow livable again. He'd start with the cabin closest to the spring, the one with the most intact roof and the fewest broken windows. It would be simple living, hunting for meat, gathering what edible plants the desert offered, reading by lamplight, and maintaining the equipment that would keep them alive. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was enough. At 68, enough was all a man really needed. The first stars began to appear in the darkening sky as Tahan closed his journal and prepared to make camp one last time on the ridge. Tomorrow would bring the end of his wandering days and the beginning of whatever came after. He'd chosen this forgotten place to disappear from the world, never suspecting that the world might find him anyway. In the growing darkness below, the empty windows of Crow's Hollow stared back at him like the hollow eyes of a skull. But ghosts, Tahan had learned, were often just memories waiting for someone to give them new life. The morning sun cast long shadows across Crow's Hollow as Tahan made his way down the winding path into the valley. His pack carried the essentials for his first night in the ghost town: bedroll, water, basic tools, and enough food for several days. Kaska picked her way carefully down the rocky slope, her experienced paws finding purchase on loose stones that would have challenged a younger animal. The cabin he'd chosen sat at the far end of what had once been the main street, close enough to the natural spring to hear the gentle sound of moving water. Its log walls showed the weathering of decades, but the foundation looked solid and most of the windows still held glass. The front door hung slightly askew on leather hinges that had somehow survived the desert climate. Tahan approached slowly, studying the ground for signs of recent habitation. Old habits died hard, and 20 years of tracking had taught him to read the stories written in disturbed earth and bent grass. Nothing seemed amiss, just the expected signs of small animals that had likely used the abandoned buildings for shelter over the years. He reached for the door handle, noting how the wood had swollen in its frame from the previous winter's rare rains. It took effort to push it open, the hinges groaning in protest as morning light spilled into the dim interior. That's when he saw them. A woman stood at the far end of the single room, her arms spread protectively in front of two children who pressed. Close behind her, her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes, jeans and a faded blue shirt, were clean but showed the wear of long use. Her eyes, wide with fear and determination, never left his face. The children appeared around her, with the cautious curiosity of the very young, trying to assess whether the stranger represented safety or danger. A boy of perhaps 8 years, with serious dark eyes and a stubborn set to his jaw that reminded Tahan of his own childhood determination. A little girl, maybe 5, clutched a small carved wooden horse to her chest, the kind of toy that spoke of someone trying to maintain normalcy in desperate circumstances. For a long moment, nobody moved. Tahan could hear his own heartbeat in the sudden silence, could feel Kaska's tension as she sensed the unexpected situation. The woman's breathing was quick and shallow, the kind that came from being constantly ready to run. "Please," the woman said finally, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We're not causing any harm. We'll leave if you want us to, but please don't hurt the children." Tahan slowly removed his hat, a gesture of respect his mother had. He taught him decades ago when dealing with frightened people. "Ma'am, I'm not here to hurt anyone. This is just unexpected." The boy stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between his mother and Tahan in a gesture that was both brave and heartbreaking. "We were here first," he said, his young voice carrying a fierce protectiveness. "Mama says squatters' rights count for something." "Miguel," the woman said softly, placing a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "Let me handle this." Tahan looked around the cabin with new eyes, noticing details he'd missed in his initial shock. A sleeping area had been arranged in the corner, with blankets that, while worn, were clean and neatly folded. Canned goods were stacked along one wall, not many, but organized with the care of people who knew the value of every meal. A small camp stove sat on what had once been the cabin's table, alongside a water jug and basic cooking utensils. They'd been living here for some time, and doing it with more dignity than their circumstances should have allowed. "How long?" he asked simply. The woman, he judged her to be in her early 30s, though hardship had drawn lines around her eyes that spoke of experiences beyond her years, straightened her shoulders. 3 months. We've taken care of the place, fixed what we could. We haven't damaged anything. Mama makes the leaky roof stop dripping," the little girl piped up, her voice tiny but proud. "And I helped." Despite everything, Tahan felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. The child's faith in her mother's abilities was absolute, the kind of trust that only came from knowing someone would move mountains if necessary to keep you safe. "I'm Tahan," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "This is Kaska, and I own this place now, bought it 3 days ago." The woman's face went pale, but she didn't back down. "I'm Esperanza. These are my children, Miguel and Lucia. And I know you have every right to make us leave, but we have nowhere else to go." There was no pleading in her voice, no manipulation, just the stark honesty of someone who had learned that dignity was sometimes all you had left. Kaska, who had been sitting quietly beside Tahan, suddenly rose and padded across the room toward the children. Both Esperanza and Miguel tensed, but the wolf's movements were gentle, almost tentative. She sniffed the air near Lucia, then sat down just within reach. The little girl looked at her mother, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Lucia extended one small hand toward the wolf, her fingers barely brushing the graying fur on Kaska's head. "Pretty," Lucia whispered, and Kaska's tail gave a single approving wag. The moment broke something in Tahan's chest, some wall he'd built around the part of him that remembered what it felt like to protect the innocent. He'd seen that expression on his daughter's face the first time she'd met Kaska, that wonder and delight that children found in the most unexpected places. "You can't stay here," he said, and watched hope die in Esperanza's eyes. Then he continued, "This cabin's got problems with the roof. Drainage isn't good either. The one closer to the spring is in better shape." Understanding dawned slowly on her face. "You're not making us leave. Winter's coming in a few months," Tahan said gruffly. "This isn't a place to be unprepared." He looked at the children, who were watching the exchange with the intensity of young people who understood that adult conversations often determined their fate. "But I've got work to do around here, and I'm not running a charity. If you stay, you earn your keep." Miguel stepped forward again, his chin raised with determination. "I can work. I'm strong." "I can work too," Lucia announced, not to be outdone by her brother. Tahan studied them both with the same careful attention he'd once used to evaluate potential hunting partners. Miguel had the lean build of a boy who'd grown up fast, with calluses on his hands that spoke of someone already familiar with hard work. Lucia had the resilient energy of a child who adapted to whatever circumstances she found herself in. "We'll see," he said finally. "Tonight you stay put. Tomorrow we'll move you to the other cabin and figure out how this is going to work." Esperanza's shoulders sagged with relief, though she tried to hide it. "Thank you," she said simply. "We won't be a burden, I promise." Tahan nodded curtly and turned toward the door, suddenly needing air and space to think about what he'd just committed himself to. At the threshold, he paused. "One rule," he said without turning around. "No lying between us, ever, about anything. I don't care how bad the truth is, I need to know what I'm dealing with." "Agreed," Esperanza said immediately, as Tahan stepped back into the morning sunlight, Kaska close beside him. He wondered what kind of fool bought a ghost town to find solitude and then invited a family to stay. But somewhere deep in his chest, in a place that had been cold for 20 years, he felt the faintest stirring of something that might have been warmth. Behind him, he could hear Lucia asking her mother if the wolf would come back to visit, and Miguel's more practical question about whether they'd really get to move to a better cabin. Their voices carried the tentative hope of people who had learned not to trust good fortune too quickly. Tahan walked toward the spring, needing to think and plan. His simple retirement had just become considerably more complicated. But as Kaska looked back toward the cabin, where two children were probably still talking about the wolf who had let them pet her, he found he couldn't quite regret the complication. Some ghosts, he was beginning to understand, were harder to lay to rest than others. Dawn arrived with the persistent chill that desert mornings carried even in late spring. Tahan had slept fitfully in his bedroll near the spring, his mind churning with the implications of what he'd agreed to the day before. Every practical instinct told him he'd made a mistake. Taking responsibility for strangers went against everything he'd learned about survival and self-preservation. But when he walked back toward the occupied cabin, he found Esperanza already awake, tending a small fire outside the door. She'd managed to brew coffee in a battered metal pot, and the smell carried a comfort he hadn't realized he'd missed. "Morning," she said quietly, offering him a chipped ceramic mug. "Figured you'd be up early." The coffee was weak but hot, and Tahan accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Where are the children?" Still sleeping. Miguel had nightmares again last night, so they're both exhausted. She studied his face in the growing light. "You're having second thoughts." It wasn't a question, and Tahan appreciated her directness. "Maybe. This isn't what I came here for." "I know." Esperanza sipped her coffee, her gaze moving across the ghost town as the sun painted the buildings in shades of gold and rust. "You came here to be alone, and we're about as far from alone as three people can be." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. The morning light revealed details he'd missed in yesterday's tension. The way she held herself with careful control, the faint shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many nights with too little sleep, the unconscious way she positioned herself to keep watch on multiple approaches to their temporary shelter. "What are you running from?" he asked. She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but carried an undertone of old fear. My husband. Ex-husband, legally speaking, though he doesn't see it that way. She took another sip of coffee. He's not the kind of man who accepts being told no. The simple words carried enough weight that Tahan understood without needing details. He'd seen enough of the world to know what kind of damage men could do when they confused ownership with love. How long since you left? 4 months. We stayed with my sister in Albuquerque for a few weeks, but he found us there, then a friend. In Phoenix, but that didn't last either. He has money, connections, people who'll look for us if he pays them enough. Miguel's voice came from the cabin doorway. Mama, is everything okay? Esperanza's expression immediately shifted to one of calm reassurance. Everything's fine, mijo. Come have some breakfast. The boy emerged, followed by his sister, who was clutching her wooden horse and rubbing sleep from her eyes. They'd clearly been listening, and Miguel's face held the tight expression of a child trying to be braver than his years allowed. We're moving today, Tahan announced, making the decision as he spoke. To the cabin by the spring. Better water, access, and the roof solid. Lucia perked up immediately. Can Kaska come visit us there too? She goes where I go, Tahan said, then found himself adding, and I'll be working around that area, so you'll probably see her plenty. While Esperanza prepared a simple breakfast of canned beans and hardtack, Tahan walked to the spring cabin to assess what needed to be done. The building was indeed in better condition. Logs chinked properly, windows intact, and a stone fireplace that would provide both heat and cooking capability. But it would need cleaning, and there were practical considerations about privacy and space. The old mining camp had been built for single men or couples without children. Adapting it for a family would require some creativity. By mid-morning, they'd begun the process of moving the small collection of belongings that represented everything Esperanza and her children owned. Tahan found himself studying their possessions with the same attention he'd once given to tracking signs, reading the story they told. A few changes of clothes for each person, all clean and mended, despite their obvious age. A small collection of books, children's stories for Lucia, more advanced readers for Miguel, and a worn paperback novel that was clearly Esperanza's escape from reality. Basic camping equipment that spoke of someone who'd learned to live with very little, and scattered throughout small items that revealed their efforts to maintain normalcy. Lucia's wooden horse, a deck of cards with only 51 remaining, Miguel's collection of interesting rocks, and a small photograph that Esperanza kept face down among her things. You travel light, Tahan observed, as they carried the last of the items to the new cabin. You learn what matters, Esperanza replied, and what you can't afford to carry. The afternoon was spent making the space livable. Esperanza proved to have a practical competence that impressed Tahan. She could assess problems quickly and find solutions with whatever materials were available. When the cabin's rusty water pump refused to work, she spent an hour with Tahan's basic tools, cleaning corrosion and replacing a worn gasket with a strip of leather cut from an old belt. Miguel shadowed Tahan's movements, asking questions about everything from the age of the buildings to the habits of desert animals. The boy had an eager intelligence and an appetite for learning that reminded Tahan painfully of his own curiosity at that age. Lucia appointed herself Kaska's official caretaker, bringing the aging wolf water in cupped hands and chattering to her about anything that crossed her mind. The wolf tolerated the attention with patient dignity, though Tahan noticed she stayed close to the little girl, as if some protective instinct had awakened. By evening, they'd established the basic rhythms of shared space. Esperanza insisted on preparing the meal, using supplies from Tahan's pack, supplemented by their own dwindling stores. Miguel helped gather firewood, selecting pieces with the care of someone who understood that fuel was precious. Lucia arranged smooth stones around their seating area, creating what she announced was a proper family circle. As the sun set and the desert air began to cool, they sat around the fire sharing a meal that was simple but felt more substantial than the sum of its parts. The conversation was careful, polite, the kind of tentative communication that happened when people were testing the boundaries of an unfamiliar relationship. "Tomorrow, we need to talk about practical things," Tahan said as they finished eating. "Water sources, food stores, what kind of work needs doing around here?" "I can fix most mechanical things," Esperanza offered. "Motors, pumps, basic electrical work. Learned it from my father before he passed." Miguel looked up eagerly. "And I'm good at finding things. Mama says I notice everything. I can make things pretty," Lucia added seriously. "And I'm very good at taking care of animals." Tahan nodded, already beginning to see how their skills might fit together. "We'll figure it out as we go." Later, after the children had been settled for the night and Esperanza had banked the fire, Tahan found himself sitting outside the cabin, looking up at stars that seemed brighter than they had in years. Kaska lay beside him, her breathing steady and peaceful. "You sure about this, old girl?" he asked quietly. The wolf's tail thumped once against the ground, her equivalent of a shrug. Whatever happened, they'd face it together, as they always had. Inside the cabin, he could hear the soft sounds of a family settling into sleep. Lucia murmured something to her mother, and Esperanza's voice responded with gentle reassurance. Miguel's breathing had finally steadied into the deep rhythm of exhausted youth. For the first time in 20 years, Tahan wasn't alone in the darkness. The realization should have been unsettling, but instead he found it oddly comforting. Perhaps some kinds of solitude were more burden than blessing. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, promising changes ahead. Tahan pulled his jacket closer and prepared for another sleepless night of thinking about what he'd gotten himself into. But this time, the sleeplessness felt less like anxiety and more like the anticipation of something he hadn't even known he was missing. The sound that woke Tahan wasn't unusual for the desert, the harsh, barking cough of a child fighting for breath. But it cut through his sleep like a blade, triggering instincts that had been dormant since his own daughter's illness 20 years ago. Inside the cabin, Esperanza was already up, kneeling beside Lucia's makeshift bed. The little girl's breathing came in sharp, labored gasps, and even in the dim light of early dawn, Tahan could see the flush of fever on her small face. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, moving to crouch beside them. "Started about an hour ago," Esperanza said, her voice carefully controlled despite the worry in her eyes. "She was fine when she went to sleep, but she's been coughing more the past few days." Tahan placed the back of his hand against Lucia's forehead, feeling the heat radiating from her skin. The child's eyes were bright with fever, but she managed a weak smile when she saw him. "My chest hurts," she whispered, clutching her wooden horse tighter. "I know, little one," Tahan said gently. He turned to Esperanza. "Have you dealt with this before?" "A few times, but never this bad. In Phoenix, I could at least get to a doctor, but out here—" She gestured helplessly at the isolation surrounding them. Miguel had awakened and was watching from his own bedroll, his young face tight with the same fear Tahan remembered from his own childhood, the terror of helplessness when someone you loved was in pain. "Miguel," Tahan said quietly, "I need you to help me gather some things. Can you do that?" The boy nodded immediately, grateful to have something useful to do. For the next hour, Tahan drew on knowledge he'd hoped never to need again. His years of living alone in the desert had taught him which plants could ease breathing and reduce fever, skills passed down from his grandmother and refined by necessity during long months without access to modern medicine. He sent Miguel to gather willow bark from the trees near the spring, while he collected desert sage and a particular variety of mint that grew in the shaded areas between rocks. Esperanza watched his preparations with the intense attention of someone memorizing every detail. "My grandmother would make a steam tent," Tahan explained as he prepared the medicinal tea. Helps open the airways, and this bark, he held up the willow, works like aspirin for the fever. The improvised treatment required patience and constant attention. They took turns sitting with Lucia, monitoring her breathing and temperature, while the others maintained the steam treatments and prepared the herbal remedies. Kaska stationed herself near the sick child's bedside, her presence somehow calming despite the wolf's inability to directly help. By afternoon, Lucia's fever had begun to break, and her breathing had eased enough that she could rest peacefully. The crisis had passed, but it left all of them emotionally drained and acutely aware of how vulnerable they were in their isolated location. "You saved her life," Esperanza said, as they sat outside the cabin in the late afternoon sun, both of them exhausted from the day's vigil. "Maybe," Tahan said. "Or maybe she would have gotten better on her own. Children are tougher than we think." But Esperanza shook her head. "I saw how bad she was getting, without your knowledge, without those plants." She paused, collecting herself. "I don't know how to repay something like that." "You don't," Tahan said simply. "That's not how it works." That evening, as Lucia slept peacefully, and Miguel had finally been convinced to eat something, Tahan found himself studying this family he'd somehow acquired. The crisis had stripped away the polite distance they'd been maintaining, revealing something deeper underneath. Esperanza moved around their shared space with quiet efficiency, but he noticed how she never fully relaxed, how her attention was constantly divided between caring for her children and monitoring their surroundings. She was a woman who'd learned that danger could come from any direction, at any time. Miguel had handled the day's emergency with a maturity that was both admirable and heartbreaking. At 8 years old, he already understood that adults weren't always strong enough to fix everything, that sometimes children had to be braver than they wanted to be. And Lucia, even in her illness, had tried to comfort the adults around her, apologizing for being sick and worrying about whether Kaska was getting enough attention. "Tell me about their father," Tahan said when the children were finally asleep. And he and Esperanza were banking the fire for the night. Esperanza was quiet for a long time, staring into the dying flames. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat tone of someone recounting facts too painful for emotion. "His name is Marcus, and for the first few years I thought I was lucky to have married him. He was successful, charming, generous with gifts and attention. It took me too long to realize that what I thought was devotion was actually control." She picked up a stick and poked at the coals, sending sparks dancing into the night air. "It started small. Comments about my friends, suggestions about how I should dress, opinions about where we should live. I told myself it was because he cared about me. Then Miguel was born, and Marcus wanted to make all the decisions about his upbringing. Then Lucia came along, and suddenly I wasn't allowed to make any choices at all." Tahan waited, understanding that she needed to tell this story at her own pace. "The hitting started when Miguel was 6, never where anyone could see the marks, and always with apologies afterward. He'd buy expensive gifts and promise it would never happen again. For a long time I believed him because I needed to believe him." "What changed?" Tahan asked. He hit Miguel. The words came out flat and final. "My son tried to protect me during one of Marcus's rages, and Marcus backhanded him across the face. That's when I knew we had to leave, no matter what it cost us." She looked up at Tahan, her expression fierce despite the tears threatening in her eyes. "I won't let my children grow up thinking that's what love looks like. I'd rather live in a ghost town in the middle of nowhere than go back to that." Tahan nodded slowly. He'd known men like Marcus, men who confused power with strength, who needed to control others to feel important. The desert was full of predators, but the human variety were often the most dangerous. "How did you find this place?" he asked. "Accident, mostly. We were driving through, trying to get lost, and Miguel spotted the turnoff. The road was so overgrown, I almost missed it. When we found the town, it seemed like Providence, somewhere Marcus would never think to look, and stood up, preparing to check on the children one more time before settling in for the night. "I know this complicates things for you," she said. "Having us here puts you at risk too, if he ever tracks us down. If you want us to leave, nobody's leaving," Tahan said firmly. "We'll figure it out as we go." Later, as he lay in his bedroll, under the vast desert sky, Tahan thought about the day's events. Lucia's illness had forced all of them to confront how quickly their careful arrangements could collapse, how dependent they'd become on each other in just a few short days. 20 years ago, he'd walked away from his own family's graves and sworn never to care about anyone that deeply again. The pain of loss had seemed too high a price for the comfort of connection, but watching Esperanza fight for her daughter's life, seeing Miguel's quiet courage in the face of fear, feeling Lucia's small hand grip his while she struggled to breathe, all of it had awakened something in him that he'd thought was permanently buried. Kaska raised her head from where she lay beside his bedroll, her amber eyes reflecting the starlight. "I know, old girl," he murmured. "This isn't what we planned." The wolf settled back down, with what sounded remarkably like a contented sigh. Perhaps some plans were meant to be changed. Above them, the desert stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles but somehow comforting in their constancy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about how 4 people and 1 aging wolf could build something like a family in a place that had been abandoned by the world. But tonight, in the quiet breathing of sleeping children and the soft rustle of desert wind through sage, Tahan found something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, the peace that came from knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 3 weeks had passed since Lucia's illness, and Crow's Hollow had begun to feel less like a hiding place and more like a home. The daily rhythms they'd established gave structure to their days. Tahan would wake before dawn to check the weather and plan the day's work, while Esperanza prepared breakfast and got the children ready for whatever tasks lay ahead. Miguel had become Tahan's shadow, absorbing lessons in tracking, plant identification, and desert survival with the intensity of someone who understood these skills might mean the difference between life and death. The boy had a natural aptitude that surprised even Tahan. He could read animal tracks with an accuracy that took most people years to develop, and his ears could distinguish between different bird calls in ways that revealed the approach of strangers or changes in weather. "See how the rabbit tracks bunch up here?" Tahan pointed to marks in the soft earth near the spring. "That means something spooked it, made it run." Miguel crouched down, studying the sign with careful attention. "Could be a hawk, could be. Or could be a person walking where rabbits don't expect them. Always ask yourself what story the tracks are telling." Lucia had recovered completely from her respiratory illness, but the experience had changed her relationship with Tahan. She no longer treated him as an intimidating stranger. Instead, she'd appointed herself his unofficial apprentice. In what she called taking care of everybody, she would bring him water when he was working, gather the specific plants he taught her to recognize, and provide running commentary on Kaska's daily activities that was both amusing and surprisingly observant. "Kaska's walking slower today," she announced during breakfast one morning. "I think her front paw hurts." Tahan looked at the wolf, who was indeed favoring her right foreleg slightly. He'd noticed it himself, but was impressed that the 5-year-old had picked up on such a subtle change. "Good eyes, little one. What do you think we should do about it?" Lucia considered this with the seriousness she brought to all problems. "Maybe she needs to rest it? Like when I hurt my ankle and Mama made me sit still." "That's exactly right." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of an engine in the distance, the first motorized vehicle any of them had heard since arriving in Crow's Hollow. Esperanza immediately tensed, her hand moving unconsciously toward the kitchen knife she'd been using to prepare food. "Miguel, take your sister inside," Tahan said quietly. "Esperanza, stay with them." But even as he spoke, he was moving toward the rifle that hung above the cabin's fireplace, an old Winchester that had belonged to the original miners. He'd cleaned and tested it shortly after arriving, understanding that isolation meant self-reliance in all things. The vehicle, a dusty pickup truck that had seen better decades, came to a stop at the edge of town. A single occupant climbed out. A man in his 50s, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap, moving with the unhurried gait of someone who wasn't looking for trouble. Tahan stepped out of the cabin, rifle held casually but ready. "Help you with something?" "Maybe," the stranger called back. "Name's Pete Dunham. I run supplies up to some of the mining claims north of here. Saw smoke from your fires and figured I'd check if anyone needed anything." The explanation was reasonable, but Tahan had learned long ago that reasonable didn't always mean harmless. "We're doing fine. Appreciate you stopping by." Pete nodded, but didn't immediately return to his truck. "Haven't seen anyone living in Crow's Hollow for near 20 years. You folks planning to stay long?" "Long as we need to." Tahan's response was deliberately non-committal. "Fair enough. Just so you know, there's a general store in Millfield about 40 miles south if you need supplies. Old Highway 191 will get you there, and if you ever need help with anything, mechanical problems, medical emergency, that sort of thing, I pass through here about once a month." Pete reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, which he set on the hood of his truck. "My radio frequency and the number for the sheriff's office in Millfield, just in case." After the man drove away, Tahan retrieved the paper and studied the information. It represented connection to the outside world, which was both reassuring and concerning. If they could contact help when needed, it also meant others could potentially track them down. "Who was that?" Miguel asked when Tahan returned to the cabin. "Someone who might be a friend," Tahan replied, "or might not be. Time will tell." That evening, as they shared dinner around their usual fire, Esperanza brought up the encounter again. "Do you think he was really just being neighborly?" "Probably," Tahan said. "But out here, you assume everyone's a threat until they prove otherwise. It's kept me alive this long." The conversation drifted to other topics, but Tahan noticed how Esperanza remained more alert than usual, her attention constantly scanning their surroundings. The unexpected visitor had reminded all of them how exposed they were, how easily their refuge could be discovered by someone with less benign intentions. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Tahan and Esperanza sat outside watching the stars. These evening conversations had become a ritual, a time when they could speak freely about adult concerns without worrying about frightening Miguel and Lucia. "Tell me about your family," Esperanza said. "Before you came here, I mean." Tahan was quiet for a long time, surprised by how much the question hurt even after 20 years. "My wife was called Dawn. She taught school on the reservation, had a gift for making children want to learn. My daughter was 12 when they died, smart as a whip, wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up." "What happened to them?" "Influenza. Came through the reservation one winter and took a lot of people, but it seemed to hit the healthy ones worst. Dawn got sick first, then our daughter caught it while she was helping me take care of her mother." He picked up a stone and turned it over in his hands. "They died 3 days apart." Esperanza reached over and briefly touched his arm, a gesture of comfort that asked nothing in return. "I couldn't stay after that," Tahan continued. "Everything reminded me of them. The house we'd built together, the places we used to walk. Even the sunrise looked wrong without Dawn there to share it. So I packed what I could carry, took the puppy our daughter had been raising, and just started walking." "And you've been walking ever since?" "Until 3 weeks ago, yes." He looked toward the cabin where Miguel and Lucia slept peacefully. "Funny how life has a way of bringing you full circle, whether you want it or not." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Esperanza spoke again. "I never had a chance to have the kind of marriage you did. With Marcus, even the good times felt like I was playing a role in someone else's story. I used to watch other couples and wonder what it felt like to be with someone who actually saw you as an equal partner. You'll have that chance again," Tahan said, "when all this is over. When you're safe, you're still young enough to build whatever kind of life you want. Maybe. Right now I can't imagine trusting anyone that way again. The children are enough." She paused. "More than enough, actually. Being their mother is the first thing I've ever done that I knew I was good at." A coyote called from somewhere, in the darkness beyond the town, its voice carrying across the desert with a loneliness that seemed to echo Tahan's own memories. But somehow, tonight the sound didn't seem quite so desolate. Perhaps loneliness was just another burden that became lighter when shared. "We should think about winter preparations," Tahan said, shifting to practical matters. "If we're going to stay through the cold months, we'll need more firewood, better insulation for the cabin, and a larger store of preserved food. You think we'll still be here in winter?" The question held layers of meaning. Winter was still months away. But staying that long would represent a commitment to this strange family arrangement they'd fallen into. It would mean accepting that their temporary shelter had become something more permanent. "I think we'll be wherever we need to be," Tahan said carefully. "All of us." As they prepared to settle in for the night, Tahan found himself looking forward to the next day's work with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. There would be the usual tasks: hunting, maintaining their water supply, teaching Miguel new skills, but also the simple pleasure of shared meals and evening conversations, of Lucia's chatter and Kaska's patient presence. It wasn't the solitude he'd come to Crow's Hollow seeking, but it was something he hadn't known he needed. For the first time since losing his own family, Tahan was beginning to understand that healing didn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it meant finding new reasons to keep going. The rabbit hung from Miguel's snare with the satisfied weight of success, its neck cleanly broken by the boy's careful construction. It was his first solo kill, achieved after weeks of patient instruction and numerous failed attempts that had tested both his determination and Tahan's teaching abilities. "I did it," Miguel breathed, his voice barely containing his excitement. "I actually did it." Tahan examined the snare setup with the critical eye of someone who understood that attention to detail meant the difference between eating and going hungry. The positioning was perfect, the trigger mechanism balanced precisely, and the killing loop had functioned exactly as designed. "Good work," he said simply, but the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "Your grandfather would be proud." Miguel's face glowed at the praise. Over the past month, their relationship had evolved from wary cooperation to something approaching the bond between grandfather and grandson. The boy had hunger for knowledge that reminded Tahan painfully of his own daughter at that age, combined with a practical competence that spoke well for his survival in a harsh world. They dressed the rabbit according to Apache tradition, using every part of the animal and offering thanks for its sacrifice. Miguel watched intently as Tahan demonstrated the proper cuts, the way to separate hide from meat without waste, and how to prepare the organs that would provide essential nutrients. "Mama's going to be so surprised," Miguel said as they prepared to return to town with their prize. "Surprised and proud," Tahan agreed. "But remember, this isn't about impressing anyone. It's about taking responsibility for feeding your family. That's a serious job for a serious person." Miguel nodded, understanding the weight of what was being passed down to him. In the old days, a boy's first successful hunt marked his transition toward manhood. These weren't the old days, but some traditions carried wisdom that transcended circumstances. Back at Crow's Hollow, they found Esperanza and Lucia working on what had become their latest project: restoring the ghost town's old schoolhouse. What had started as Lucia's desire for a proper place to keep my books had evolved into an ambitious renovation that showcased Esperanza's mechanical skills and problem-solving abilities. "Look what we did," Lucia called out as she saw them approaching. "We fixed the windows and everything." The single-room schoolhouse had indeed been transformed. Broken windows had been replaced with salvaged glass from abandoned buildings. The floor had been swept and scrubbed clean, and someone had even managed to repair the old pot-bellied stove that would provide heat during winter months. But what caught Tahan's attention was the evidence of Esperanza's more complex work. She'd managed to restore the building's hand pump water system, creating a functional wash basin and improving the overall livability of the space. "How did you figure out the pump mechanism?" he asked, genuinely impressed by the engineering involved. Esperanza wiped her hands on a rag, leaving streaks of grease and rust stains that spoke of hours spent troubleshooting mechanical problems. "Same principle as the cabin pump, just more complicated. The original miners were pretty clever about water management." She led him to the back of the building, where she'd uncovered and restored a sophisticated rainwater collection system that fed into underground cisterns. "If we can get this fully operational, we'll have water storage that could last through a dry winter." The conversation was interrupted by Kaska's low growl, a warning that sent everyone immediately alert. The aging wolf stood at the edge of town, her attention focused on something beyond the visible horizon. "What is it, girl?" Tahan asked, moving to stand beside her. In the distance, barely visible through the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor, a dust cloud marked the approach of vehicles, plural vehicles moving faster than the casual pace of someone making a social call. "Inside," Tahan said quietly. "All of you, right now." But even as they moved toward shelter, he could see. It was too late to hide their presence. The dust cloud was resolving into two vehicles, a large black SUV and a smaller car following behind, and they were heading directly for Crow's Hollow. "Who do you think it is?" Miguel asked, his voice tight with the fear that had become second. "Nature for all of them." "I don't know," Tahan replied, checking the Winchester and making sure he had extra ammunition within reach. "But we're about to find out." The vehicles stopped at the town's edge, engines running, car doors slammed, and three men emerged from the SUV while a fourth stayed behind the wheel. They moved with the coordinated precision of people who'd worked together before, spreading out to cover multiple approaches. The man who appeared to be their leader was tall and well-dressed despite the desert heat, wearing expensive boots and a shirt that probably cost more than most people made in a week. Everything about him radiated money and the kind of confidence that came from being used to getting what he wanted. "Marcus," Esperanza whispered, and the name carried all the terror Tahan had expected. "Stay down," he told the children. "No matter what happens, you stay hidden." Marcus stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the empty space between the vehicles and the buildings. "I know you're in there, Esperanza. And I know you've got my children with you. This doesn't have to be complicated if you just don't come out and talk to me like a reasonable person." His tone was calm, almost conversational, but Tahan could hear the steel underneath. This was a man who'd practiced being charming while planning violence. "I just want my family back," Marcus continued. "We can work this out. I've changed, gotten help with my anger issues. The kids need their father, and you need someone to take care of you properly." Esperanza was shaking, but her voice was steady when she whispered to Tahan, "He's lying. He doesn't change, doesn't apologize, doesn't compromise. If he's talking like this, it means he's planning something worse than usual." Tahan studied the tactical situation with the eye of someone who'd learned to assess threats quickly. 4 armed men, good vehicles for escape, and the advantage of having arrived when they weren't fully prepared. But they also didn't know the terrain, didn't understand how many people they were facing, and hadn't accounted for the defensive advantages that Crow's Hollow's layout provided. "I'm going to talk to them," Tahan decided. "No," Esperanza said. "Immediately. You don't know what he's capable of, what he'll do if he thinks you're in his way." "Maybe not," Tahan replied, "but I know what I'm capable of, and I know this town better than they do." He stepped out of the cabin, rifle held openly, but not directly threatening, projecting the kind of calm readiness that experienced hunters recognized in each other. "You're on private property," he called out. I'd appreciate it if you'd state your business and move along." Marcus studied him with obvious surprise. Whatever he'd expected to find in this ghost town, it clearly wasn't a weather-beaten Apache, with the bearing of someone comfortable with violence. "You must be the local who's been helping my wife hide from me," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something harder. "I appreciate the hospitality you've shown them, but this is a family matter. Doesn't concern you. Everything that happens in this town concerns me," Tahan replied. "And the lady says she doesn't want to talk to you. I'm inclined to respect her wishes." One of Marcus's companions, a younger man with the restless energy of someone looking for an excuse to start trouble, took a step forward. "Maybe we need to explain the situation more clearly, old man." But Marcus raised a hand, stopping the advance. "Easy, Jake. Let's keep this civilized." He turned his attention back to Tahan. "I can see you're a reasonable man. Military background. Maybe you understand how things work in the real world?" Tahan said nothing, but his grip on the rifle shifted almost imperceptibly. "Here's the situation," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "That's my wife in there, and those are my children. I have legal rights, court documents, and the resources to make this very unpleasant for anyone who interferes with me exercising those rights." "Legal rights don't mean much out here," Tahan observed, "and I'm not impressed by your resources." Marcus's carefully maintained composure slipped slightly. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I own half the construction companies in Phoenix, have connections in law enforcement, and enough money to make problems disappear. If you think some old Indian with a hunting rifle can stand in my way, you're badly mistaken." The racial slur hung in the air like a challenge, and Tahan felt the familiar cold anger that had gotten him into trouble in his younger days. But age had taught him patience, and Kaska's low growl reminded him that he wasn't the only one ready for whatever came next. "Maybe I am mistaken," Tahan said quietly, "but here's what I know for certain. You're going to get back in those vehicles and leave. Now." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Or what? You'll shoot 4 armed men. Even if you managed it, which I doubt, you'd be a murderer. Is protecting some woman you barely know worth throwing your life away?" Before Tahan could answer, Miguel's voice rang out from the cabin doorway. "He's not some woman. He's our family, and you're not my father anymore." The boy stepped into view despite Esperanza's urgent whisper to stay hidden, his young face set with determination that was both brave and heartbreaking. Marcus's expression shifted, revealing something ugly beneath the civilized facade. "Miguel, get over here right now. Don't make me count to 3. "No," Miguel said, his voice wavering slightly but holding firm. "I'm not going anywhere with you. Neither is Lucia." "Boy, you don't have a choice in this matter. I'm your father and—" "You hit my mother," Miguel interrupted, his voice growing stronger. "You made us all afraid all the time. Real fathers don't do that." The words seemed to break something in Marcus. His carefully controlled demeanor cracked, revealing the rage that Esperanza had learned to fear. "You little bastard," he snarled, taking a step toward the cabin. "I'll teach you some respect." That was when Kaska moved. The aging wolf launched herself from beside Tahan with a speed that belied her years, placing herself directly between Marcus and the boy, her lips pulled back from teeth that were still impressive despite her age, and the growl that rumbled from her chest carried the promise of serious violence. Marcus stopped abruptly, suddenly reminded that there were other players in this confrontation. "Call off your dog," he demanded. "She's not a dog," Tahan replied calmly, "and she makes her own decisions about who deserves her protection." The standoff stretched taut. 4 armed men facing 1 Apache hunter, 1 protective wolf, and a family that had learned to fight for their freedom. The desert heat seemed to intensify the tension, making the air shimmer with more than just thermal waves. Finally, Marcus stepped back, his expression shifting to something calculatingly cold. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I know where you are now. I know who's helping you, and I have all the time and resources in the world to make this right." He turned to his companions. "We're leaving, but we'll be back." As the vehicles disappeared into their own dust cloud, Tahan felt the adrenaline begin to fade, leaving behind the familiar ache of old wounds and new worries. Beside him, Kaska panted heavily, the confrontation having taken more out of her than she'd wanted to show. Miguel ran to Tahan's side, his bravery finally giving way to the fear he'd been holding back. Is he really gone? Is he coming back? "He's gone for now," Tahan said, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "And if he comes back, we'll be ready." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Tahan knew their temporary peace was over. Marcus had found them, which meant their hiding place was no longer safe. Worse, he'd seen enough to understand that they weren't just refugees anymore. They'd become something like a family, which gave him new leverage and new targets. Esperanza emerged from the cabin carrying Lucia, her face pale but determined. "We have to leave," she said, "tonight, before he comes back with more people." "Running didn't work before," Tahan pointed out. "What makes you think it will work now?" "Because staying here means putting you in danger, and I won't do that to someone who's already done so much for us." Tahan looked at the restored schoolhouse, the improved cabins, the small signs of life they'd brought back to Crow's Hollow. 3 months ago, this had been a place where he'd planned to disappear from the world. Now it was home to the closest thing to a family he'd had in 20 years. "Nobody's running," he said finally. "This is our place now, and some rich man's. Threats aren't going to change that, but we are going to get ready for whatever comes next." As the sun set over the desert, painting the ghost town in shades of gold and crimson, Tahan began making the mental preparations that had kept him alive. Through decades of dangerous situations, Marcus would be back, probably with more men and better planning. When that happened, they'd need every advantage they could create. But for tonight, they were together and safe, and sometimes that was enough to build on. The photograph fell from Esperanza's trembling hands, landing face up on the rough wooden table. Even in the lamplight, the image was clear enough to make Tahan's stomach turn. Esperanza's face, swollen and bruised beyond recognition, one eye completely shut, her lip split and bleeding. But it was the smaller figure in the corner of the frame that made his blood run cold. Miguel, perhaps 6 years old, cowering behind a chair with terror written across his young features. "I kept it," Esperanza whispered, staring at the photograph as if it were a poisonous snake. "I don't know why, but I kept it. Evidence, maybe, or just to remind myself why I could never go back." They'd been discussing defensive preparations when Esperanza had suddenly disappeared into the corner where she kept her few possessions, returning with a manila envelope that clearly contained more than just the single photograph now lying before them. "There are more," she said, her voice hollow. "Pictures, medical records, police reports that were never filed because Marcus had friends in the right places. And other things, financial records, business documents that show how he really makes his money." Tahan picked up the photograph carefully, studying the woman in the image and trying to reconcile her with the strong, capable person he'd come to know. "How bad did it get?" "Bad enough that I started taking pictures every time, writing down dates and details, keeping track of the lies he told to explain my injuries." Esperanza pulled out a thick folder, its contents organized with the methodical precision of someone who understood that documentation might be her only protection. "After Miguel was born, I realized I needed proof for the courts, for child services, for anyone who might be able to help us get away." She spread the contents across the table, dozens of photographs showing injuries in various stages of healing, medical records from emergency room visits, and copies of police reports that had been filed but somehow never resulted in arrests or charges. "Marcus owns people," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Police officers, judges, social workers. He made sure I understood that no one would believe me, that even if they did, nothing would stick. He was right, mostly, but it was the business documents that caught Tahan's attention. Financial records that showed money flowing through shell companies, invoices for construction projects that existed only on paper, and correspondence that suggested Marcus's legitimate businesses were funded by considerably less legitimate activities. Money laundering, Tahan observed, studying a series of bank transfers. And probably worse than that, judging by these amounts. Esperanza nodded grimly. I started copying everything I could find after I realized leaving might not be enough. If Marcus was just an abusive husband, running away might work. But if he's connected to organized crime, he has resources and motivation to hunt us down that go way beyond hurt pride. The revelation cast their situation in an entirely different light. Marcus wasn't just a violent husband trying to reclaim what he considered his property. He was a criminal with serious money at stake and connections that reached into law enforcement. Why didn't you tell me this before? Tahan asked. Because I was hoping it wouldn't matter. I thought if we stayed hidden long enough, he'd give up and move on. I didn't want to make you a target for something bigger than just domestic violence. Tahan studied the documents more carefully, his mind working through the implications. These financial records, where did you get them? His home office. I had access to everything for years, but I only started copying things during the last few months before we left. Marcus never thought I was smart enough to understand what I was looking at. And you've had these with you this whole time? Esperanza's silence was answer enough. Outside, Kaska's warning bark shattered the evening. Quiet. Through the cabin window, Tahan could see vehicle headlights approaching, multiple vehicles moving fast. Miguel, Lucia, he called quietly, come here right now. The children emerged from the corner where they'd been playing with Lucia's wooden horse, immediately sensing the tension in the adults' voices. We need to move, Tahan said, already gathering the scattered documents. Take only what you can carry and stay together no matter what happens. But even as they prepared to flee, the approaching engines grew louder, and Tahan realized with sinking certainty that they were already too late. The vehicles were coming from multiple directions, cutting off the obvious escape routes. The mine, Miguel said suddenly. We could hide in the old mine shaft. Tahan shook his head. Too easy to trap us in there, and too dangerous. Those tunnels haven't been maintained in decades. Through the window, he could see the vehicles taking positions around the town's perimeter. Professional positioning, coordinated timing. This wasn't Marcus bringing a few hired thugs. This was a serious operation. How many people know about these documents? Tahan asked Esperanza as they gathered their essential supplies. Just me, and now you. Her face was pale but determined. I never told anyone else what I had, never used them as leverage. I was saving them for when we were somewhere safe enough. To contact the FBI? The irony wasn't lost on Tahan. They'd been carrying the key to Marcus's destruction this whole time, but had never been in a position to use it safely. Car doors slammed in the darkness outside, followed by the sound of boots on gravel and the low murmur of men organizing themselves for action. Someone was using a radio, coordinating movements with the efficiency of people who'd done this kind of thing before. Listen to me, Tahan said, kneeling down to look Miguel and Lucia in the eyes. Whatever happens tonight, you stay with your mother. If I tell you to run, you run and don't look back. If I tell you to hide, you hide until it's safe to come out. Do you understand? Both children nodded solemnly. Though Lucia's eyes were bright with tears she was trying not to shed. Voice called out from the darkness, Marcus, but with a different tone than he'd used during the afternoon's confrontation. Gone was the pretense of civilized negotiation, replaced by the flat authority of someone who held all the advantages. I know you're in there, and I know what you took from me, Esperanza. Those documents don't belong to you, and there are people who want them back very badly. People who don't have my patience or my restraint. The threat was clear enough, but it also revealed something important. Marcus wasn't just angry about losing his family. The documents represented a genuine threat to him and his associates, serious enough to justify this kind of escalation. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus continued. "You're going to bring me those files, along with any copies you might have made. In return, I'll consider letting your new friend live to see morning." Tahan checked the Winchester's action and made sure he had extra ammunition within easy reach. "How many rounds do we have total?" "Enough," he murmured, though he knew that against a professional operation, ammunition was the least of their concerns. Outside, the sound of footsteps suggested that Marcus's people were taking positions around the cabin, cutting off any hope of escape, but they also seemed to be waiting for orders, which suggested that negotiation was still possible. "I'm going out there," Esperanza said suddenly. "No, you're not. If I give him what he wants, he'll kill all of us anyway," Tahan finished. "Men like Marcus don't leave witnesses, especially not witnesses who've seen too much." Through the window, Tahan could see the silhouettes of armed men positioned around Crow's Hollow's main street. Professional spacing, overlapping fields of fire, and the patient discipline of people who knew their business. For the first time since arriving at the ghost town, Tahan found himself facing a situation where his hunting skills and desert knowledge might not be enough. Marcus had brought serious firepower and professional expertise to bear, turning their refuge into a trap. But as he looked at Miguel's determined face and Lucia's trusting eyes, at Esperanza's quiet courage and Kaska's loyal presence, Tahan felt something harden in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the fierce protectiveness that had once made Apache warriors legendary. They might be outnumbered and outgunned, but they were fighting for their home and their family. And sometimes that was enough to even impossible odds. In the hour before dawn, when the desert held its breath between the cold of night and the heat of day, Tahan moved through Crow's Hollow like a ghost returning to claim his territory. The small pot of red clay paint felt familiar in his weathered hands, a mixture he hadn't prepared in over 20 years, made from iron-rich earth and the sacred plants his grandmother had taught him to recognize. He worked methodically, applying the ancient symbols to his face and arms with the same precision his ancestors had used before battle. The ritual felt both foreign and utterly natural, awakening something in his blood that had been sleeping since he'd walked away from the reservation. Kaska watched from her position near the cabin door, her amber eyes reflecting an understanding that went beyond mere animal instinct. She knew what the paint meant, recognized the transformation taking place in her longtime companion. Inside the cabin, Esperanza was conducting her own preparations, checking the small .38 pistol she'd revealed along with the hidden documents. Her movements were efficient, despite the tremor in her hands, muscle memory from a shooting class she'd taken years ago, back when she'd still believed she might be able to protect herself through conventional means. Miguel and Lucia huddled together on the makeshift bed, trying to pretend they were asleep while actually listening to every whispered conversation between the adults. Their fear was palpable, but so was their trust in the people who'd promised to keep them safe. "Tell me about the mine shaft," Tahan said quietly, settling beside Esperanza as she finished cleaning her weapon. "Miguel mentioned it earlier. How much do you know about the layout?" "Miguel explored it a few weeks ago, against my better judgment," she replied. "He said it goes back about 50 yards before branching into smaller tunnels. Most of them are blocked by cave-ins, but there's at least one passage that connects to the old ventilation shaft on the ridge behind town." Tahan nodded, filing the information away. "And the explosives?" "What explosives? Mining operation this size would have had blasting supplies, probably stored in a magazine somewhere away from the main workings." He gestured toward the documents, scattered on the table. "Your evidence is valuable, but it's also dangerous. If something happens to us tonight, those papers need to survive." The conversation was interrupted by the crackle of a radio from outside, followed by Marcus's voice cutting through the pre-dawn quiet. "I'm done waiting, Esperanza. You have 10 minutes to bring me those documents, or we're coming in after them. And trust me when I say that things will go much easier if you cooperate voluntarily." Through the window, Tahan could see the tactical positions Marcus's people had established. At least 8 men, possibly more, with professional equipment and the patient discipline of experienced operators. They'd positioned themselves to control all approaches to the cabin while maintaining clear lines of retreat to their vehicles. "He's not bluffing," Esperanza whispered. "These aren't just hired thugs. Some of them look military." Tahan had reached the same conclusion. Marcus's money had bought him access to serious firepower, the kind of private security that specialized in making problems disappear permanently. "Miguel," he called softly, "come here, son." The boy approached with the careful dignity he'd learned to maintain during frightening situations, his young face set with determination that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "I need you to do something very important," Tahan said, kneeling to meet Miguel's eyes. "Can you find your way to that mine entrance in the dark?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I want you to take your sister and your mother to the mine. Follow the main tunnel to where it branches. Then take the passage that leads toward the ventilation shaft. Stay there until you hear 3 whistle calls, like this." He demonstrated the signal, a specific pattern his grandfather had taught him for long-distance communication. "What about you?" Miguel asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Someone needs to keep Marcus and his people busy while you get to safety." Esperanza started to protest, but Tahan held up a hand. "Those documents you've been carrying, they're Marcus's death sentence if they reach the right people, but they're also your family's life insurance. As long as he thinks you might use them against him, he can't afford to let any of you live." The brutal logic was inescapable. Marcus had committed to this course of action, brought professional killers to eliminate the threat his estranged family represented. There was no negotiation possible, no compromise that would satisfy both justice and safety. "So what do we do?" Esperanza asked. "We make sure those documents survive this night," Tahan replied. "And we make sure Marcus learns what happens when he threatens an Apache's family." The transformation in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. The calm, reflective tone of the past months, replaced by something harder, more primal. This was the voice of a man who'd once tracked armed smugglers across 100 miles of desert, who'd survived decades in places where weakness meant death. The eastern horizon began to show the first faint traces of dawn. Tahan made his final preparations. The Winchester was loaded and ready, with extra ammunition distributed in locations throughout the cabin. He'd identified 3 separate escape routes and 2 fallback positions that would provide cover while maintaining fields of fire. But more importantly, he'd awakened something in himself that had been dormant since his wife and daughter died. The fierce protectiveness that had once made him legendary among his people as a hunter and warrior. "Tell me about the radio," he said, gesturing toward the device one of Marcus's men had been using. "Military frequency? Probably," Esperanza replied. "Marcus has connections with private military contractors, people who do work the government can't officially sanction. That explained the professional competence of their opponents, but it also suggested a weakness. Military contractors operated under rules of engagement, even unofficial ones. They were used to dealing with targets who would run or hide, not with someone who understood their tactics and was prepared to fight back with traditional methods they might not expect." Kaska raised her head suddenly, her ears pricked forward. A moment later, Tahan heard it too, the subtle shift in the ambient sound that meant people were moving into final positions. "Time to go," he said quietly. Esperanza gathered the children, checking to make sure they had water and the essential supplies they'd need if they had to stay hidden for hours. The documents went into a waterproof pouch that Miguel could carry easily, their most valuable cargo entrusted to the person most likely to survive whatever came next. "Remember," Tahan told them as they prepared to slip out the cabin's rear. Window, 3 whistle calls. and if you don't hear them by full sunrise, you follow that ventilation shaft to the surface, and you keep going until you reach help." Miguel nodded solemnly, accepting the responsibility with the gravity of someone much older than his 8 years. Lucia hugged Tahan around the waist, her small arms barely reaching around his lean frame. "Don't let the bad men hurt you," she whispered. "I won't, little one," he promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. As his makeshift family disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, moving toward the mine shaft with the quiet competence they'd learned over months of hiding, Tahan felt a strange sense of completion. For 20 years, he'd wandered the desert alone, convinced that caring about others brought only pain and loss. But standing in the doorway of their cabin, watching the eastern sky begin to lighten, he understood that some things were worth fighting. For regardless of the cost, the documents in Miguel's pack would eventually bring Marcus to justice, but that was secondary to the more immediate truth. No one threatened his family and walked away unscathed. Outside, Marcus's voice called out, again closer this time and edged with impatience. "Time's up, Esperanza. Last chance to do this the easy way." Tahan checked the Winchester's action one final time, feeling the familiar weight of a weapon that had fed his family for decades and kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. Then he stepped out into the growing light, ready to show a bunch of city mercenaries what happened when they brought their sophisticated warfare to Apache country. The war paint on his face caught the first rays of sunlight, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, the ghost town of Crow's Hollow held its breath. The gold watch caught the morning sunlight as Marcus checked the time with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to having his schedule respected. Expensive Swiss craftsmanship, the kind of timepiece that cost more than most people earned in a year, a symbol of the wealth and privilege that had always insulated him from the consequences of his actions. 43 minutes past deadline, he announced to his assembled team. "I think we can safely assume that negotiation has failed." 8 men spread across Crow's Hollow's main street, their tactical gear and professional weapons creating an obscene contrast with the weathered buildings and desert landscape. They moved with the coordinated precision of people who'd performed similar operations before, each one covering specific zones while maintaining clear sightlines to their companions. Marcus himself stood slightly apart from the others, protected, but visible, the kind of positioning that spoke of absolute confidence in his hired security. He'd changed clothes since the previous day's confrontation, trading his expensive casual wear for dark tactical clothing that made him look like he belonged with the mercenaries he'd hired. "Remember," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the desert air, "the woman and children are to be taken alive if possible. They're no good to me dead, but the old man, he's expendable. Anyone who gets between me and my property forfeits any claim to consideration." From his position inside the cabin, Tahan watched through the window as the team began their final approach. Professional spacing, overlapping fields of fire, proper communication discipline, these weren't street thugs or small-time criminals. Marcus had invested in quality, but professional training also meant predictable patterns, and Tahan had spent decades learning to exploit the overconfidence that came with superior firepower. He waited until the lead elements were within 30 yards of the cabin before making his presence known. "That's close enough," he called out, stepping into the doorway with the Winchester held ready but not immediately threatening. "You're trespassing on private property." The mercenaries immediately shifted into combat stances, weapons trained, on the cabin, but Marcus gestured for them to hold position. "Where are they?" Marcus demanded. "Where's my family?" "Safe," Tahan replied simply. "And they're going to stay that way." Marcus's carefully controlled expression flickered with irritation. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, old man. This isn't some domestic dispute you can mediate with folksy wisdom and good intentions. There are serious people with serious money who want those documents back." "Then maybe you should Have thought about that before you started hitting women and children." The words hung in the desert air like a challenge, and Tahan could see Marcus's facade of civilized control beginning to crack. Whatever image the man had built of himself, it didn't include being lectured about morality by someone he clearly considered beneath his notice. "Jake," Marcus said quietly to the young mercenary who'd been eager for action the day before, "check the cabin. Everyone else maintain perimeter." It was a tactical mistake born of impatience, and Tahan had been counting on exactly that kind of error. Professional soldiers would have approached the problem systematically, but Marcus was thinking like a businessman who'd hired experts to solve his problems quickly and cleanly. Jake approached the cabin with proper caution, weapon ready and attention, divided between Tahan and the potential threats inside the building. But his focus was on the immediate tactical situation, not on the broader strategic picture that desert warfare demanded. That's when Kaska struck. The aging wolf had been positioned in the shadow beside the cabin, invisible to the approaching mercenaries. Her attack wasn't the wild charge of an animal defending territory. It was the calculated strike of a predator who understood exactly where an enemy was most vulnerable. Jake's scream echoed across the empty town as Kaska's teeth found his weapon. Her jaws clamping down with force that sent his rifle spinning away across the dusty ground. He went down hard, his tactical training momentarily forgotten in the face of 60 pounds of furious wolf. The distraction lasted only seconds, but it was enough for Tahan to move. The Winchester spoke with the authority of decades of practice. The heavy 30-30 round taking the nearest mercenary center mass and dropping him before he could bring his weapon to bear. Tahan was already moving as he worked the lever action, using the cabin's doorframe for cover while seeking his next target. Professional discipline reasserted itself quickly among the remaining mercenaries. They spread out, using the ghost town's buildings for cover while laying down suppressive fire that sent splinters flying from the cabin's log walls. But Tahan wasn't where they expected him to be. 20 years of desert hunting had taught him that survival often depended on being somewhere other than where your opponents thought you were. While they focused their attention on the cabin's front entrance, he was already circling through the building's rear exit, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who'd learned to hunt prey that could hear a footstep from 50 yards away. Marcus's voice cut through the gunfire, sharp with the kind of anger that came from having expensive plans disrupted by unexpected variables. "Where is he? Where did the old bastard go?" But his mercenaries were dealing with their own problems. Kaska had released her grip on Jake and disappeared into the maze of abandoned buildings, her grey coat blending perfectly with the shadows cast by weathered wood and rusted metal. The wounded mercenary was trying to function with his dominant arm hanging useless, while his companions struggled to track multiple threats in unfamiliar terrain. Tahan's second shot came from an entirely different angle, the heavy rifle bullet, punching through the wall of the old general store and taking down the mercenary who'd been using it for cover. The man's body armor absorbed some of the impact, but the 30-30 round carried enough energy to put him on the ground and out of the fight. "Spread out!" Marcus shouted. "He's just one man with a hunting rifle." But the dismissive tone couldn't hide the edge of uncertainty that was creeping into his voice. This wasn't going according to the plan he'd paid so much to implement. The remaining mercenaries began moving through Crow's Hollow with more caution, their professional training warring with the unsettling realization that they were being hunted by someone who understood this terrain better than they understood their own weapons. Tahan used their caution against them, moving through the ghost town like a spirit returned to claim his territory. Every building offered concealment, every shadow provided an avenue of approach, and every shot he fired came from a position his enemies hadn't anticipated. The third mercenary went down to a bullet that seemed to come from the abandoned church, though by the time his companions reached the building, there was no sign of the shooter. The fourth fell to a shot from the old mining office, and the fifth discovered too late that the saloon's rear exit provided an excellent field of fire across the town's main intersection, with half his team down and the others struggling to adapt. To an opponent who fought by rules they didn't understand, Marcus's carefully planned operation was rapidly becoming a rout. "Fall back to the vehicles," he ordered, his voice cracking with the strain of watching his expensive solution collapse into chaos. But Tahan wasn't finished teaching his lesson about the difference between hunting men and hunting animals. The hunting knife had belonged to Tahan's father and his father's father before him, 4 generations of Apache hunters who'd used its keen edge to provide for their families and defend what they held sacred. The worn leather handle fit Tahan's grip like it had been shaped by his own hands, carrying the weight of tradition and the promise of justice that could only be delivered by steel. Marcus's remaining mercenaries were in full retreat, their professional composure shattered by an opponent who refused to fight by their rules. But retreat required organization and discipline, qualities that evaporated quickly when men discovered that their expensive training hadn't prepared them for warfare against someone who treated their technology as just another disadvantage to exploit. The vehicles that had seemed like such an advantage when they'd arrived now became a liability, obvious targets that pinned their owners to predictable positions while offering minimal protection against a rifle that could punch through engine blocks. Tahan's next shot disabled the lead SUV, the heavy bullet finding its mark in the radiator and sending steam hissing into the desert air. The second vehicle tried to maneuver around its disabled companion, but the narrow dirt road that led into Crow's Hollow hadn't been designed for tactical retreats under fire. From his position in the old mining office, Tahan had clear sightlines to both vehicles and the approaches his enemies would have to use to reach them. The mercenaries were trapped in the open ground between the town and their transportation, caught in a killing field that offered no effective cover. "This is insane," Jake shouted, his wounded arm making it impossible to use his rifle effectively. "We're supposed to be hunting some old man and his family, not fighting a war." But Marcus was beyond listening to complaints from his hired help. The careful control he'd maintained for years had finally cracked completely, revealing the snarling rage that had always lurked beneath his civilized facade. "I don't care what it takes," he screamed at the remaining mercenaries. "Kill him! Kill them all! I'll pay double to anyone who brings me that old bastard's scalp." The racial slur and the bounty offer were tactical mistakes that revealed just how completely Marcus had lost control of both the situation and himself. Professional soldiers might have continued following orders, but mercenaries worked for money, and dead clients didn't pay outstanding bills. 2 of the remaining mercenaries exchanged meaningful looks before beginning to withdraw in earnest. Their weapons lowered and their attention focused on reaching whatever transportation they could salvage. The job had gone bad, and experienced operators knew when to cut their losses. That left Marcus with Jake and 1 other mercenary, a thin, nervous man whose tactical gear couldn't disguise his obvious inexperience with actual combat. Not the overwhelming force he'd planned to bring to bear, but still enough firepower to be dangerous if they managed to coordinate their efforts. Unfortunately for Marcus, coordination required leadership, and leadership required the kind of calm. Thinking that his rage had made impossible, "The mine," he shouted, pointing toward the sealed entrance that sat at the far end of town. "They're probably hiding in the mine. Jake, take Henderson and clear those tunnels." It was exactly the kind of mistake Tahan had been waiting for, an emotional decision that would divide his opponent's remaining strength while sending them into terrain where their equipment advantages would become liabilities. Kaska materialized from the shadows near the abandoned church, her grey coat making her nearly invisible against the weathered stone. The aging wolf moved with purpose toward the mine entrance, understanding without being told that her role was to ensure the mercenaries' attention remained focused in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, Tahan slipped through the ghost town's back. alleys, using buildings and terrain features to mask his movement as he positioned himself for what he knew would be the final confrontation. Marcus had to be taken alive. Esperanza's documents would be worthless without someone to testify about their authenticity and Marcus's criminal activities. The mine shaft opening was partially blocked by rusted iron bars and warning signs that had been posted decades ago when the silver played out and the operation was abandoned. Jake and Henderson approached it with the caution of men who understood that underground fighting favored defenders, but they were also driven by the knowledge that their employer's patience had reached its breaking point. "I don't like this," Henderson muttered, studying the dark opening. "Could be booby traps, cave-ins, any kind of nasty surprise waiting in there." "Yeah, well, I don't like the alternative," Jake replied, checking his equipment with his good hand. "Marcus is paying us to solve his problems, and right now his biggest problem is hiding somewhere in these tunnels." They disappeared into the darkness, their tactical lights creating dancing shadows that would make them easy targets for anyone familiar with the mine's layout. Within minutes, their voices were echoing from deep underground, distorted by rock walls and distance into unintelligible sounds. That left Marcus alone on Crow's Hollow's main street, standing beside his disabled vehicles with the gold watch still gleaming on his wrist and murder in his eyes. "I know you're out there," he called, his voice carrying the unhinged quality of someone who'd pushed too hard for too long. "You think you've won something, but you don't understand who you're dealing with. I have connections, resources, people who owe me favors. This doesn't end until I say it ends." Tahan stepped out from behind the old general store, his father's hunting knife held loosely in his right hand, while his left kept the Winchester ready for immediate use. The war paint on his face had been smeared by sweat and the morning's violence, but it still carried the authority of traditions that predated Marcus's money by countless generations. "It ends now," Tahan said simply. Marcus fumbled for the pistol at his waist, expensive tactical gear that looked impressive but had never been used in actual combat. His hands were shaking, whether from rage, fear, or the adrenaline crash that came from watching carefully laid plans collapse into chaos. "You cost me everything," Marcus snarled, trying to bring his weapon to bear. "My wife, my children, my business, all of it destroyed by some washed-up Indian playing hero." "Your wife left because you couldn't keep your hands to yourself," Tahan replied, closing the distance with the patient stalking gait of someone who'd spent decades hunting dangerous prey. "Your children are afraid of you because you taught them to be, and your business problems are just what happens when criminals get sloppy." The pistol in Marcus's hands wavered as he tried to track Tahan's movement, his finger tight on the trigger, but his aim unsteady. "I'll kill you. I'll kill all of you. No one takes what's mine and gets away with it." "They were never yours," Tahan said, and then he moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd learned violence from masters who understood that hesitation meant death. The hunting knife found its mark with surgical precision, slipping between ribs to puncture Marcus's lung, without causing immediately fatal damage. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the air as its owner collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath and staring up at the Apache hunter with eyes that finally held something other than arrogant rage. "You're going to live," Tahan informed him, as Marcus clutched at the wound. "Because dead men can't testify in court, and Esperanza's going to need you alive to make sure those documents get the attention they deserve." From the mine shaft came the sound of voices calling out in surrender, Jake and Henderson discovering that hunting people in dark tunnels was considerably more difficult than their training had suggested, especially when their quarry included an aging wolf with intimate knowledge of every passage and hiding place. The sun had fully risen over Crow's Hollow, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise new beginnings. In the distance, Tahan could hear the three-whistle signal he'd taught Miguel, announcing that his family was safe and ready to emerge from their hiding place. Marcus would live to face justice for his crimes. His mercenaries would answer questions. about who hired them and why, and Esperanza's carefully preserved evidence would finally see the light of day in a courtroom where money and connections couldn't suppress the truth. But for Tahan, the most important victory was simpler and more personal: the knowledge that when his family had needed protection, he'd been strong enough to provide it. The wooden sign was Miguel's idea, carved during the long summer evenings when the desert heat made outdoor work impossible, but the boy's restless energy demanded some kind of productive outlet. He'd used skills Tahan had taught him, shaping letters with the patient precision of someone who understood that worthwhile things took time to create properly. Crow's Hollow, population 4, read the weathered board that now stood at the town's entrance, replacing the old mining company marker that had long since fallen to rust and wind. Below the population count, in smaller letters, Miguel had added "all welcome," because, as he'd explained to anyone who would listen, their town was the kind of place where people who needed refuge could find it. 6 months had passed since the morning when federal agents had arrived to take Marcus and his surviving mercenaries into custody, drawn by Esperanza's carefully preserved evidence and the testimony that would eventually put several criminal organizations out of business permanently. The legal proceedings were still working their way through the courts, but Marcus himself was facing enough charges to ensure he'd never again pose a threat to anyone. The ghost town had continued its transformation from abandoned relic to something that resembled a home. The schoolhouse was fully operational now, serving as both classroom where Esperanza taught the children and community center where the small family gathered for evening meals when the weather was pleasant. The old church had been restored enough to provide shelter for travelers, while the general store had become a workshop where Esperanza's mechanical skills found full expression. But it was the small cemetery behind the town that revealed the most significant change. A new grave marker stood beside the weathered crosses of long-dead miners, a simple stone that read, "Kaska, faithful friend and guardian." The old wolf had passed peacefully in her sleep 2 months earlier, her body finally surrendering to the accumulated years and the injuries she'd sustained protecting the family she'd adopted. Tahan had buried her according to Apache tradition, with ceremonies that honored both her loyalty and the spirit that had made her more than just an animal companion. Miguel and Lucia had insisted on carving their own farewell messages into smooth stones that now surrounded the grave, creating a memorial that would endure long after the desert reclaimed everything else. "She's still watching over us," Lucia had announced, with the absolute certainty that children brought to matters of spiritual importance. "I can feel her sometimes, especially when I'm scared about something." The loss had been difficult for all of them, but it had also marked a transition from the desperate circumstances that had brought them together to something more stable and forward-looking. They were no longer refugees hiding from immediate danger. They were a family, building a life together in a place they'd claimed as their own. Pete Dunham, the supply runner who'd first encountered them months earlier, had become a regular visitor, and unofficial connection to the outside world. He brought mail, supplies that couldn't be produced locally, and news from the broader region that helped them stay connected to events beyond their desert sanctuary. "Got something special for you folks this trip," he announced as his battered pickup truck pulled into town on a crisp October morning. From the truck's bed, he unloaded a large package that had clearly traveled a considerable distance to reach them. The return address identified the sender as the Apache Cultural Center on the reservation where Tahan had been born, and the contents proved to be more precious than anything money could buy. Carefully wrapped in traditional fabrics were items that represented his heritage: beadwork created by tribal elders, ceremonial objects that had been held in trust for him, and photographs of family members he'd thought were lost forever. "Your cousin Joseph asked me to tell you that the door is always open," Pete explained, handing over a letter that had been included with the package. "Says the community's been wondering about you for 20 years, hoping you'd find your way home eventually. Tahan read the letter with growing emotion, learning that his extended family had never stopped looking for him, never given up hope that he might return to share the wisdom he'd gained during his years in the wilderness. The reservation had changed considerably since he'd left, but the bonds of kinship and culture remained as strong as ever. "What do you think?" Esperanza asked that evening as they sat around their usual fire, the children examining the cultural artifacts with the reverence that Tahan had taught them to show for sacred things. "Do you want to visit them?" The question carried implications that went far beyond a simple trip. Reconnecting with his tribal community would mean acknowledging that his years of self-imposed exile were truly over, that he'd found his way back to being the kind of person who could accept love and belonging without fear of loss. "Maybe," he said carefully, "but not permanently. This is our home now, and I'm not walking away from what we've built here." Miguel looked up from the beadwork. He'd been studying with intense concentration. "Could they visit us instead? I'd like to learn more about the old ways, but I don't want to leave Crow's Hollow either." It was, Tahan realized, the perfect solution. Over the following months, a steady stream of visitors began making the journey to their remote settlement. Tribal, elders who shared stories and traditions, young people curious about desert survival skills, and families who simply wanted to experience the peace that seemed to permeate the restored ghost town. Crow's Hollow became known throughout the region as a place where ancient wisdom met practical necessity, where people could find both physical refuge and spiritual renewal. The population sign had to be updated regularly as temporary residents came and went, but the core family of 4 remained constant. Esperanza's legal troubles were resolved when a federal prosecutor offered her full immunity in exchange for her testimony against Marcus and his criminal associates. The documents she'd preserved proved instrumental in dismantling a money laundering operation that had corrupted officials throughout the Southwest, and her courage in coming forward was officially recognized with commendations that she displayed proudly in the schoolhouse. More importantly, she'd begun to heal from the trauma of her abusive marriage, finding strength in the daily challenges of desert life and confidence in her growing reputation as someone who could fix anything mechanical. The skills her father had taught her, dismissed by Marcus as irrelevant to a proper wife, had become the foundation for genuine self-respect and independence. Miguel, now 9, and showing every sign of growing into the kind of man his community could be proud of, had mastered tracking skills that impressed even experienced hunters. His patient attention to detail and natural empathy made him an ideal student of traditional knowledge, while his protective instincts toward his family ensured he'd never forget the lessons about standing up to bullies. Lucia, at 6, had appointed herself the town's official welcomer of visitors and caretaker of its history. She could recite the story of every building, every grave marker, and every significant event that had shaped Crow's Hollow's transformation. Her wooden horse, the same toy that had comforted her during their earliest days as refugees, now occupied a place of honor in the schoolhouse alongside other artifacts from their journey. As winter settled over the desert with the kind of cold that made indoor fires a necessity rather than a luxury, Tahan found himself reflecting on the unexpected turns his life had taken. He'd come to this place seeking isolation and found family instead. He'd tried to escape from caring about others and discovered that some responsibilities were too important to abandon. The evening conversations around their fire had evolved from desperate planning sessions to comfortable discussions about future possibilities. They talked about expanding the garden that provided fresh vegetables, about the solar panel array that might allow them to offer hospitality to more visitors, and about the children's education as they grew old enough to make their own choices about where and how they wanted to live. "Do you ever regret it?" Esperanza asked one night as they watched stars wheel across a sky unmarked by city lights. "Giving up the solitude you came here looking for?" Tahan considered the question while studying the familiar constellations, his Grandmother had taught him to navigate by decades ago. "No," he said finally, "I thought I wanted to be alone, but what I really wanted was to be home. It just took me a while to understand the difference." The fire crackled between them, sending sparks dancing toward stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear desert air. Tomorrow would bring the usual challenges: maintenance work that never ended, lessons to teach and learn, the constant vigilance that desert living demanded. But tonight, in the quiet breathing of sleeping children and the soft whisper of wind, through sage, Tahan had found something more valuable than the gold that had originally drawn miners to this remote valley. He'd found the peace that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by the people who mattered most. The ghost town had been reborn, not as the bustling mining camp it had once been, but as something better, a place where wounded souls could heal, where traditions could be preserved and passed on, and where family could be defined by choice rather than blood. Sometimes the best treasures were the ones you found when you weren't looking for them at all.